November 22nd, 1942. Northern steppe west of Stalingrad. 6:10 hours. The temperature is well below freezing. Wind slides across the open ground without resistance, carrying dry snow that stings exposed skin like grit. Boots crunch softly. Breath hangs in short white bursts, immediately torn apart by the air. Steel helmets are rimed with frost. Rifle bolts are worked carefully, deliberately, to keep oil from seizing. Engines idle somewhere behind the line, low, uneven, restrained. The sound carries farther than it should in the cold. Tracks have cut shallow scars into frozen earth, already hardening again. Nothing moves quickly here. Not men, not machines, not time. Across the steppe, visibility is deceptive. The horizon looks empty, but it is not. Artillery is emplaced beyond sight. Infantry waits in shallow dugouts, scraped from ground that refuses the shovel. Telephone wires lie stiff and exposed, vulnerable to a single shell fragment, a single passing vehicle. The men standing here know the city is close. They know the Volga is still contested. They know winter has arrived early and without mercy. What they do not know, what no one here can yet see, is that the ground beneath them has already become a boundary. Orders are brief. Maps are unfolded and refolded with gloved hands. Watches are checked. Somewhere, a flare will rise. Somewhere, guns will open. But not yet. For a moment longer, the soundscape holds. Wind, engines, breath, the faint creak of leather and webbing. History has slowed itself to a narrow, fragile pause just before the pressure breaks. Context/background. Part 1. The road to the Volga. The winter of 1941 had not ended the war in the East. It had merely stripped away its illusions. By March 1942, the German Army Group Center had survived, but at a cost that was no longer abstract. Divisions were under strength. Vehicles were worn past their maintenance cycles. Experienced infantrymen had been buried in frozen ground outside Moscow, Vyazma, and Klin. Yet the strategic problem remained unresolved. The Soviet Union was still fighting, still mobilizing, still producing. In Berlin, the solution was reframed rather than abandoned. On April 5, 1942, Adolf Hitler issued Directive No. 41. The Schwerpunkt of the war would shift south. The objective was no longer the political heart of the Soviet state, but its economic arteries. Oil from the Caucasus, grain from the Kuban, the Volga River, an industrial and logistical spine running north to south, feeding factories and armies alike. The operation was given a name already weighted with expectation: Fall Blau, Case Blue. Army Group South was divided in July. Army Group, it would drive into the Caucasus. Army Group, you would secure the northern flank and advance toward the Volga. On paper, the division made sense. In practice, it stretched an already thin force across hundreds of kilometers of steppe, river crossings, and supply lines that terminated at a single rail gauge conversion point deep in occupied territory. At the center of Army Group B stood General Friedrich Paulus' Sixth Army. By the summer of 1942, the Sixth Army was one of the most formidable formations Germany could field. Approximately 270,000 men at full strength. Veteran divisions hardened by France, the Balkans, and the first year in Russia. Artillery regiments with combat experience. Engineers trained for river crossings and urban combat. Confidence was not merely encouraged, it was institutional. Stalingrad was not initially the primary objective. It was a name on the map, a factory city on the Volga, a junction. But as operations progressed, the city acquired symbolic gravity. It bore Stalin's name. It sat astride the river. Its capture promised both material and psychological gain. By August, Luftwaffe bombers were overhead. The city burned before the infantry arrived. Entire districts were reduced to rubble in days. Civilian casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. Smoke and dust flattened the skyline into a continuous gray smear. Yet destruction did not equal control. The ruins absorbed German momentum. Streets collapsed into kill zones. Factory complexes became fortresses. The Red Army, bleeding and retreating elsewhere, concentrated here. New formations were rushed across the Volga under artillery fire, often at night, often without heavy equipment. For the Soviet command, Stalingrad became a fixing point. For the German High Command, it became a test of will. And all the while, the front lengthened. The Sixth Army pushed east while its flanks were held not by German infantry, but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies, stretched thin along open steppe with limited anti-tank capability. The city consumed attention. The flanks consumed space. By September, the fighting inside Stalingrad was measured in meters. By October, it was measured in stairwells, cellars, and factory floors. Winter clouds began to roll in from the east. The war had not slowed. It had narrowed, and beyond the city, unseen by most of the men fighting inside it, Soviet reserves were assembling, quietly, methodically, behind a front that looked exhausted but was not yet broken. Context/background. Part 2: Weather, Doctrine, and Miscalculation. By late October 1942, the weather shifted with little warning. Daytime thaws gave way to hard freezes at night. Mud, Rasputitsa, tightened its grip on roads already cratered by bombs and overrun by traffic. Vehicles sank to their axles, then froze in place. Recovery became a matter of hours, then days. Often, it did not happen at all. The German operational doctrine that had defined early victories, speed, encirclement, relentless forward pressure, depended on momentum and supply. In the South, both were eroding. Fuel trucks traveled hundreds of kilometers from railheads that were themselves vulnerable to Soviet air and partisan attack. Winter clothing was inconsistent. Many units still relied on summer-issue uniforms supplemented by whatever could be scrounged locally. Cold was not yet catastrophic, but it was present. It infiltrated metal and skin. Lubricants thickened. Batteries lost charge. Artillery crews kept small fires burning near breaches to prevent mechanisms from freezing solid. On the Soviet side, the war had become one of survival and adaptation. The disasters of 1941 and early 1942 had forced structural change. The Red Army refined deep battle concepts, not as theory, but as necessity. Large-scale offensives were planned with layered artillery, armor exploitation, and operational reserves held beyond immediate contact. At the center of this planning was Stavka, the Soviet High Command. While German forces fought street by street inside Stalingrad, Soviet intelligence tracked the thinning of Axis flanks. Aerial reconnaissance, partisan reports, captured documents. The pattern was unmistakable. Long sectors held by under-equipped Allied armies, with limited mobility and insufficient anti-tank guns. The response was calculated. Two major Soviet fronts were designated to strike these flanks: the Southwestern Front under Nikolai Vatutin and the Don Front under Konstantin Rokossovsky, with the Stalingrad Front under Andrei Yeremenko coordinating pressure from the south. Armor and artillery were concentrated out of sight, camouflaged against early snowfalls. Rail lines east of the Volga delivered men and material at a tempo Germany could no longer match. German intelligence detected activity, but misread its scale and intent. The assumption persisted that the Red Army was near exhaustion, incapable of a large operational maneuver. Reports warning of Soviet armor concentrations were filed, noted, and ultimately discounted. Leadership compounded the risk. Hitler's direct involvement in operational decisions increased throughout the summer and autumn. Withdrawal from Stalingrad was rejected outright. The city was to be taken, then held. The flanks, he believed, could be stabilized with existing forces. General Paulus, methodical and precise, was not a commander inclined to challenge strategic directives. Requests for flexibility were framed cautiously. The word breakout was never seriously entertained while the city fight continued. By early November, snow covered the steppe in uneven sheets. Rivers skimmed with ice. Daylight shortened. Aircraft struggled in low cloud and freezing fog. Every movement took longer. Every mistake cost more. The conditions that made catastrophe possible were now fixed in place. Extended fronts, brittle alliances, overconfidence born of earlier success, and an enemy preparing to strike not at the city, but around it. The pressure that had been building since summer was no longer abstract. It was about to be released. Angles, Part 11. Human endurance. Inside the city and along the flanks, endurance became a daily calculation rather than an abstract virtue. Food arrived irregularly. Rations were reduced in increments small enough to be explained as temporary. Bread froze solid overnight. Soup, when available, cooled into a gelatinous mass within minutes. Men ate quickly, standing because sitting meant stiffness that might not pass. Sleep was fragmented. Artillery fire marked time more reliably than watches. In the ruins of Stalingrad, walls radiated cold long after fires were extinguished. Frost formed on the inside of helmets. Hands lost sensation first, then dexterity. Soldiers learned to perform tasks by habit because feeling could no longer be trusted. Medical stations were overwhelmed. Trench foot appeared alongside shrapnel wounds. Frostbite cases multiplied as men removed boots to dry socks, only to find the leather frozen solid by morning. Evacuation routes were narrow, exposed, and often shelled. Many wounded simply remained where they fell, insulated by rubble and snow, waiting for darkness or silence that might not come. On the steppe, exposure was more immediate. Wind stripped heat from bodies faster than exertion could replace it. Improvised shelters collapsed under snowfall or were abandoned as units shifted position. The cold did not distinguish between veteran and replacement, between officer and enlisted. It applied itself evenly and without pause. What sustained most men was not ideology or strategy, but proximity. A shared cigarette, a canteen passed down a line. The simple confirmation that someone else was still there, breathing in the same air. Endurance was not heroic. It was mechanical. It was repetition under narrowing margins. And as the cold deepened, the margin grew thinner. 2. Tactical reality. The battlefield around Stalingrad refused clarity. Urban combat erased lines and simplified objectives until they became brutal and immediate. Hold this wall, deny that doorway, keep the staircase closed. Control shifted hour by hour. A factory floor taken at dawn could be lost by noon and retaken by nightfall. German doctrine emphasized coordinated movement. Infantry supported by armor, artillery, and air power. In the city, this integration fractured. Tanks could not maneuver among collapsed buildings. Artillery risked friendly fire in confined spaces. Aircraft struggled to identify targets through smoke, dust, and weather. The Red Army adapted to this fragmentation. Small assault groups infiltrated through sewer lines, cellars, and shell holes. Snipers operated from concealed positions, forcing German units to slow, to hesitate. Artillery fire was registered by memory and map reference rather than observation, saturating known approach routes rather than pursuing precision. Beyond the city, the steppe offered no such cover, but it offered speed. Soviet armored units, trained for deep penetration, were positioned where German defenses were thinnest. Their objective was not attrition, but rupture. Once a line broke, it would not be reformed easily in frozen terrain. German infantry divisions holding the flanks lacked depth. Their anti-tank weapons were limited in number and often insufficient against newer Soviet models. Communications depended on exposed wire and overstretched radio networks. A breach in one sector could not be quickly sealed by reserves. There were none close enough. Tactically, the front was brittle. It appeared solid because it had not yet been tested at scale. The test was coming. 3. Technology under ice. Weapons behaved differently in the cold. Machine guns required constant maintenance. Metal contracted, tolerances tightened, springs weakened. Oil thickened. Crews stripped mechanisms and reassembled them repeatedly, sometimes running weapons nearly dry to avoid freezing altogether. Mortars and artillery pieces demanded equal attention. Shell fuses were sensitive to temperature. Misfires increased. Crews warmed ammunition with body heat before loading, a dangerous but common practice. Recoil systems stiffened, altering firing patterns and increasing wear. Vehicles suffered most visibly. Engines resisted ignition. Radiators cracked. Tracks snapped under stress. Recovery vehicles could not reach disabled tanks without risking immobilization themselves. Fuel consumption rose as engines idled longer to prevent freezing, draining already strained supplies. Aircraft faced layered constraints: icing at altitude, fog at airfields, frozen ground equipment. Sorties were delayed or canceled outright. Air superiority became conditional, dependent on weather windows measured in hours. The Red Army faced the same physics, but with shorter supply lines and increasing numerical advantage. Simpler designs proved more forgiving. Crews were accustomed to operating in winter conditions. Losses were accepted as part of momentum rather than reason for pause. Technology did not decide the battle alone, but under ice and wind, it magnified every advantage and every flaw. Angles, Part 24. Leadership decisions. At the operational level, decisions were increasingly centralized and increasingly rigid. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the Sixth Army from a headquarters that moved frequently, staying just beyond the city's edge. His staff worked with precision. Maps updated, casualty figures logged, ammunition counts tracked, but their latitude narrowed with each directive from above. Strategic authority rested with Adolf Hitler, whose focus on Stalingrad hardened into fixation. The city was no longer simply a tactical objective. It had become a symbol of resolve. Orders emphasized holding ground over maneuver. Withdrawal, even to shorten lines, was forbidden without explicit approval. This command environment discouraged initiative. Field commanders framed reports carefully, emphasizing compliance over concern. Requests for reserves were answered with assurances that none could be spared. Luftwaffe support was promised in theory, constrained in practice. On the Soviet side, leadership operated differently. Stavka set broad objectives, but allowed front commanders discretion in execution. Vatutin, Rokossovsky, and Yeremenko coordinated across boundaries, synchronizing movements rather than competing for credit. Political oversight remained present, but operational planning was grounded in material assessment. Enemy strength, terrain, timing. The contrast was not ideological, but functional. One command structure tightened control as uncertainty increased. The other distributed responsibility to exploit it. As the Soviet plan matured, German leadership remained focused inward, on the city, on immediate gains, on maintaining the appearance of progress. The gap between intention and reality widened quietly. 5. Enemy miscalculation. The German assumption that the Red Army lacked the capacity for a major counteroffensive persisted into November. Earlier Soviet attacks had been costly and limited in scope, reinforcing the belief that reserves were depleted. Intelligence reports indicating massed armor north and south of Stalingrad conflicted with this narrative and were downgraded accordingly. Axis flanks were assigned to Allied formations as a matter of necessity. Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies held extensive sectors with minimal depth. Their equipment was outdated, their anti-tank guns often ineffective against modern Soviet armor. Requests for reinforcement were acknowledged, but not acted upon. Training and doctrine further compounded vulnerability. Defensive positions were linear, designed to hold ground rather than absorb breakthrough. Once penetrated, these lines offered little resistance in depth. Communications between units were sparse. Coordination with German formations was limited by language, equipment, and trust. When the attack came, it would not be a probing effort. It would be a concentrated blow against precisely these weaknesses. The miscalculation was not that the Red Army would attack. It was the belief that it could be contained. 6. Psychological strain. By mid-November, strain manifested in subtle ways. Rumors circulated faster than orders. Soldiers spoke of encirclement in half-joking tones, testing the idea aloud. Maps were studied not for objectives, but for distances. How far to the Don? How far west? Mail slowed, then stopped. Radios crackled with static. Weather reports took on outsized importance, shaping expectations for air support and resupply. The future narrowed to the next meal, the next shelling, the next night without frostbite. Officers felt the pressure differently. They've balanced adherence to orders with the realities they observed firsthand. To acknowledge the danger openly risked discipline. To ignore it entirely risked collapse. Many chose silence. On the Soviet side, anticipation replaced uncertainty. Units waited in concealment, engines muffled, movements restricted to darkness. Political officers reinforced purpose, but it was preparation, not rhetoric, that dominated. Men cleaned weapons. Crews rehearsed routes on maps and in memory. The psychological balance shifted. One side braced for impact without fully understanding its direction. The other waited for a signal it trusted would come. When it did, there would be no gradual adjustment. Only motion. Climax/turning point. Part 1 Encirclement. November 19th, 1942. 7:20 hours. The first shells land north of Stalingrad under a low, colorless sky. Snow lifts from the steppe in brief, violent plumes. The sound is not a single detonation, but a rolling pressure. Artillery layered in depth, calibrated not for shock alone, but for disorientation. Communications lines are cut almost immediately. Forward observers are forced flat against frozen ground, unable to see beyond a few hundred meters. This is Operation Uranus. The attack is led by the Southwestern Front, striking the positions of the Romanian Third Army along the Don River. The bombardment lasts more than an hour. When it lifts, Soviet infantry advances behind rolling fire, armor engines already turning over despite the cold. T-34s emerge from concealment in staggered waves, their tracks biting into frozen soil that favors speed over traction. Romanian anti-tank guns open fire. Some rounds strike true. Many do not penetrate. The engagement is brief, uneven, and decisive. Defensive lines collapse in segments rather than all at once. Units fall back without coordination, leaving gaps that widen by the minute. By midday, Soviet tank corps are through the first line and accelerating westward. To the south, on November 20th, the pattern repeats. The Stalingrad front attacks the Romanian Fourth Army, positioned along open steppes south of the city. Snow and fog reduce visibility. German liaison officers struggle to establish contact. Requests for air support are delayed by weather and distance. The breakthrough comes faster than expected. German reaction is fragmented. Local commanders request permission to redeploy reserves that do not exist. Mobile units are ordered forward piecemeal, arriving too late or in insufficient strength. Reports sent to 6th Army headquarters are incomplete, sometimes contradictory. The scale of the attack is not immediately understood. Inside Stalingrad, the fighting continues almost unchanged. Men trade grenades across factory floors. Snipers remain in position. Artillery duels echo across the Volga. Few realize that the battlefield's center of gravity has shifted far beyond the ruins. By the evening of November 20th, Soviet armor is advancing deep into the German rear areas. Supply columns are overrun. Headquarters units displace hurriedly, leaving equipment behind. The steppe, once a buffer, has become a corridor. On November 21st, the Soviet pincers continue to close. The 26th Tank Corps reaches the Don Bridge at Kalik. German attempts to demolish the crossing fail. By nightfall, Soviet forces are across the river, sealing the last viable western escape route. The encirclement is no longer theoretical. It is forming kilometer by kilometer, hour by hour. At 6th Army headquarters, the word Kessel, cauldron, enters operational language. Paulus reports the situation to Army Group B. The response is delayed, cautious, noncommittal. Orders arrive, emphasizing defense of current positions. The ring is not yet closed, but it is tightening. Climax/turning point. Part 2, the closed ring. November 22nd, 1942. 1600 hours. Kalik on Don. Soviet armor reaches the junction west of Stalingrad from the north and south almost simultaneously. Units of the 4th Tank Corps and 26th Tank Corps link up amid burning vehicles and abandoned supply wagons. There is no ceremony, no pause. The confirmation is transmitted in brief radio messages, stripped of excess language. The encirclement is complete. Inside the perimeter, the Sixth Army does not yet fully grasp the permanence of what has occurred. Initial assessments suggest a temporary setback, something to be stabilized, then reversed. Maps are redrawn. Perimeters are marked. Ammunition dumps are inventoried. Paulus requests permission to conduct a breakout toward the southwest while fuel remains. The request moves up the chain of command, where it slows and hardens. The reply arrives from Führer headquarters within hours. The Sixth Army will hold its ground. Stalingrad must not be abandoned. Supply will be maintained by air. The decision locks the situation in place. The Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring, had assured Hitler that an airlift was feasible. On paper, calculations are optimistic. In reality, the numbers never align. The Sixth Army requires a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness. Even under ideal conditions, the available transport aircraft, Ju-52s, He-111s, and a handful of larger machines, cannot sustain this volume. Weather intervenes immediately. Snowstorms, ground flights, fog blankets, airfields. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire increase losses. Crews fly longer routes to avoid interception, burning fuel they cannot replace. Aircraft land on improvised strips inside the pocket, unload under fire, and depart with wounded, if conditions allow. Fuel becomes the critical constraint. Tanks are immobilized to conserve what remains. Artillery fire is rationed. Vehicles are cannibalized for parts. Units are ordered to hold sectors regardless of strength, regardless of exposure. Temperatures drop sharply in December. Nighttime lows reach -20 degrees Celsius, then lower. Snowdrifts harden into ice. Shelters collapse. Medical supplies dwindle. Wounds that might have been survivable weeks earlier become fatal through infection and cold. Soviet forces do not rush the pocket. They compress it methodically. Artillery fire probes for weakness. Infantry advances shorten the perimeter. Each contraction reduces available airfields, increasing the difficulty of resupply. Inside the Kessel, command coherence erodes. Divisions are reduced to Kampfgruppen. Regiments disappear as functional units. Radio traffic grows desperate, then sparse. Orders are issued knowing they cannot be fully carried out. By early January 1943, the pocket is split in two by Soviet advances. Paulus headquarters relocates to the city center. Men fight from cellars and ruined factories not to gain ground, but to delay collapse. On January 30th, Hitler promotes Paulus to General Feldmarschall, a rank no German officer had ever surrendered with. The implication is understood. It changes nothing. On February 2nd, 1943, the remaining German forces in Stalingrad laid down their weapons. Resistance ends in the northern pocket earlier that day. The southern pocket follows hours later. Approximately 90,000 German and Axis soldiers go into captivity. Fewer than 6,000 will return home after the war. The battle is over, but its consequences are only beginning to unfold. Aftermath. Part 1. Living inside defeat. In the days following surrender, the battlefield settles into a different rhythm. Weapons are stacked. Vehicles stand frozen where they stopped weeks earlier. Smoke thins and drifts away, revealing a city reduced to geometry. Broken walls, exposed beams, streets erased by rubble and snow. For those taken prisoner, movement begins immediately. Columns form under guard. Many men cannot walk without assistance. Frostbite has blackened fingers and toes. Dysentery and typhus spread quickly in weakened bodies. Soviet medical facilities are overwhelmed. Treatment is triage, not recovery. Inside the former pocket, the material record of collapse is everywhere. Artillery pieces without ammunition. Tanks without fuel. Field kitchens abandoned beside empty sacks. Documents burned in haste or left behind entirely. The Sixth Army ceases to exist not as a moment, but but as an accumulation of failures frozen in place. Casualty accounting begins. Of the more than 280,000 Axis troops committed to the Stalingrad operation, approximately 150,000 are dead or missing by February 1943. The remainder, mostly German, but also Romanian, Italian, Croatian, and auxiliary personnel, enter captivity under conditions that mirror the battle's severity. Starvation, exposure, and disease claim tens of thousands within months. For the Soviet Union, victory comes at extraordinary cost. Estimates vary, but Soviet casualties, killed, wounded, missing, exceed 1 million during the Stalingrad campaign. Entire divisions are shattered. Replacement units arrive from training depots already depleted by earlier offensives. Victory does not restore strength. It confirms endurance. Psychologically, the shift is immediate. Within the Red Army, Stalingrad becomes proof that the German Wehrmacht can be not only stopped, but destroyed in entirety. Training manuals are rewritten. Doctrine is reinforced. Confidence hardens, not into recklessness, but into expectation. Within Germany, the impact is delayed but profound. Official announcements frame the defeat as heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. The scale of loss is minimized. But letters do not arrive. Units do not return. Entire formations vanish from the order of battle. On February 18, 1943, Joseph Goebbels delivers his Sportpalast speech, calling for total war. The appeal is not proactive, it is reactive. The war has crossed a threshold from which retreat, political or military, is no longer imagined. At the front, the consequences are operational. Army Group South must be reconstituted. Defensive lines are shortened. Strategic initiative shifts eastward. German commanders now plan not for decisive breakthroughs, but for controlled withdrawal and stabilization. The winter continues. Snow still falls across the ruins of Stalingrad. The Volga remains frozen, its surface scarred by tracks and shell holes. Beneath it, bodies remain unrecovered, embedded in ice and debris. The battle has ended, but the cost has not finished revealing itself. Aftermath, Part 2: Surrender and Shockwaves. The destruction of the Sixth Army reshapes the Eastern Front within weeks. German operational planning, once driven by offensive calendars, pivots toward containment. Reserves earmarked for future advances are redirected to seal gaps and rebuild shattered sectors. The initiative that had defined German warfare since 1939 no longer dictates events. In the South, Soviet forces exploit the collapse methodically. The Red Army advances along the Don and toward Rostov, threatening to cut off Army Group A in the Caucasus. Only a rapid withdrawal, conducted under pressure and in winter conditions, prevents a second encirclement. Oil fields remain out of reach, their capture postponed indefinitely. Across Axis Europe, confidence fractures. Romania and Hungary reassess their commitments. Italy's already strained expeditionary forces suffer devastating losses along the Don. The perception of German invincibility, carefully cultivated for years, dissolves in the face of documented annihilation. Within Germany itself, the shock permeates slowly but irrevocably. The Wehrmacht absorbs not just manpower losses, but a generational rupture in experience. Veteran non-commissioned officers, the backbone of German tactical effectiveness, are disproportionately lost. Replacement formations lack cohesion, training time, and institutional memory. The Luftwaffe, heavily committed to the failed airlift, emerges weakened. Transport aircraft losses cannot be replaced at pace. Crews are exhausted. The promise that air power alone can sustain isolated ground forces is discredited, not in theory, but in irrevocable fact. Internationally, Stalingrad alters perception. Allied governments take note of Soviet resilience and capacity for large-scale offensive coordination. Planning assumptions shift. The Eastern Front is no longer viewed as a delaying theater, but as the decisive arena of the European war. For the Soviet Union, the victory becomes both symbol and burden. The state elevates Stalingrad as a marker of sacrifice and unity. Medals are struck. Units are redesignated as guards. But the reality behind the symbolism remains austere. The Red Army must continue fighting at a pace that tolerates extraordinary loss. The city itself does not recover quickly. Reconstruction begins amid ruins that still conceal unexploded ordnance and human remains. Factories are rebuilt even as fighting continues hundreds of kilometers to the west. Civilian survivors return to landscapes stripped of infrastructure, living alongside the residue of battle. Strategically, Stalingrad does not end the war, but it defines its trajectory. From this point forward, German forces will fight increasingly on ground chosen by the enemy, under conditions dictated by necessity rather than ambition. The balance of momentum, once assumed permanent, is revealed as contingent and reversible. The winter of 1942 to 1943 passes into memory not as a season, but as a dividing line. Before Stalingrad, German defeat was hypothetical. After it, defeat is measurable. Reflection/closure. Stalingrad did not end quietly. Its closure was measured in frozen streets, shattered buildings, and the thin columns of survivors marching into captivity. Yet the true weight of the battle was not in the numbers alone, nor in the maps redrawn, nor even in the destruction of a city. It was in the demonstration of limits, of men, of machines, of strategy when confronted by time, terrain, and climate. For the German army, the winter revealed vulnerability beneath technical superiority. Tanks could be immobilized, guns could freeze, supply lines could not be stretched indefinitely without collapse. Doctrine, no matter how rigorously applied, faltered under the combined pressure of overextended fronts and an enemy adapting methodically. Victory was no longer a function of audacity or preparation. It was a negotiation with cold, distance, and endurance. For the Red Army, Stalingrad crystallized a capacity to endure and to execute coordinated operations on a scale previously unimagined. The deep battle doctrine, once theoretical, proved effective when logistics, timing, and terrain were mastered. Commanders learned the value of patience and concealment, of waiting for opportunity rather than forcing confrontation. Men learned, painfully, that survival and perseverance were as decisive as firepower. The human dimension remained stark. Frostbite, starvation, exhaustion, and the unrelenting pressure of winter dictated decisions as much as any general. Leadership, technological sophistication, and tactical skill were constrained by factors beyond human control. History was shaped not only by intent, but by the environment itself. Wind, ice, darkness, and the simple limits of endurance. In the years that followed, Stalingrad would be referenced in manuals, memorials, and strategy discussions. Yet its lesson is concrete and elemental. Even the most disciplined, well-equipped, and determined army is vulnerable to the interplay of logistics, terrain, weather, and human limitation. Victory is never absolute. Defeat is never singular. The winter of 1942 to 1943 did not merely freeze a city. It froze a moment in time when the nature of industrial war, its scale, its fragility, its dependence on men and machines alike, was revealed in the harshest possible terms. Stalingrad endures as a measure of endurance, consequence, and the cost of standing still when the world itself will not.